Welcome everyone to the final session of Mishnah in Depth Eduyot with Dr. Yitz Landes, who we have had the pleasure of learning with these past few weeks. This class, Mishnah in Depth, is sponsored by Rifka Rosenwein's family and in their continued support of the Mishnah Division. This class is following the Mishnah Yomit schedule, which where we're under the assumption that you're learning 1 to 2 mishnayot every day, including Yantav and Chol HaMoed, and we will come together once a week to learn 1 to 2 mishnayot together. This is the last class on Eduyot, as we are transitioning from Eduyot to Avodah Zarah in the coming week. And so for those who have been continuously coming, thank you. For those who are just joining in, also thank you. And with that, I'd like to hand things over to Dr. Landes.
Great. So thank you, and Modin Simcha. This is our last time, as mentioned, talking about Eduyot, although in the Mishnah Yomit schedule, there's a few more days of Eduyot ahead of us. So I will actually do a little more material, I guess, than we did until now in prior weeks. I know I said that I'm going to try and spend some time also doing some concluding thoughts about the tractate in general. Therefore, there are some mishnayot that I might just kind of speak about from kind of bird's eye summary of them, or maybe skip over time if the time does not allow us to go in depth into those mishnayot. But I would like to try and get through actually a lot of the material in these mishnayot. It's really rich. We get really back to this kind of style of the testimonies that we saw in the beginning of the tractate, whereas last week we saw more of a different kind of a different style that was more about just listing these differences between Beit Shammai and the leniencies of Beit Shammai, which is odd, and different people who had different traditions about these differences between Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel. So now we are going back into the more classic kind of Eduyot style of testimonies. And actually, there's a lot of interesting material also that really goes back seemingly to the time of the temple. So it really kind of getting to this early stage of the recouping of the rabbinic community following the destruction of the temple, now in Yavna, and looking back at things that they remember from the time of the temple. So because of that, I think these final chapters are really, really interesting to kind of see what that moment was like for the rabbis and how they imagined it, how they remembered it, and how they really sought to kind of recover knowledge before it, or to kind of retain knowledge or recover knowledge before it was lost. I'm going to share my screen, and feel free to interject if there's any questions, but I also will try and pause for questions at various times. Great. And everyone can see that, right? Kaylee, you can see that?
Yep, I can see it.
So so this is, as I described it, a return to testimonies, right? We had this other kind of style of lists. Again, different from a lot of things that we see in the Mishnah, in that it wasn't really topically organized, but more formally organized or structurally organized. And it was a way, it seems, for the rabbis to try and remember this kind of unique situation, halacha, when Beit Shammai is more lenient than Beit Hillel. Whereas now we're going back to Hi'i, right? These testimonies that different rabbis had, seemingly testimonies about early rabbinic practice from before the destruction. So we start off with Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava, Eid Chamishad, right? He testified to 5 things. She'mema'anim et haktanot, ושמסעין את האישה על פי עד אחד, ושנסכל תרנגול בירושלים על שהרג את הנפש, והיין בן 40 יום שננסך על גף המזבח, ועל תמיד של שחר שקרב ב4 שעות. 5 different testimonies from entirely different areas of halacha, or almost entirely different areas of halacha. The first 2 have to do with marriage, and specifically this question of if someone who is a minor, a woman who's a minor, is married not exactly according to her own will to somebody else, she has the ability to therefore annul the marriage after she has opinions, or she becomes an adult and decides that she does actually not want to be in this marriage. This has to do specifically with whether or not a woman is an aguna, right? So if she is still an aguna and the whereabouts of her husband are not known, she cannot get married to anyone else. And here it's saying that you only need 1 witness. Usually we might need 2 witnesses for anything kind of in halacha. But in this case, 1 witness testifying that her husband had died would be enough for her to then be allowed to go get married, and she is now an almana, a widow, and not an aguna. Right, so animals that kill humans eventually need to get killed themselves. It doesn't seem that common for a tarnagol, for a rooster to kill somebody, but it once happened in Jerusalem. This is a testimony that Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava has. And basically the teaching from this is that even animals which don't normally kill are also liable for the death of humans and therefore also must be killed. Wine, as we know from the Seder, perhaps can be of different vintages or different ages. And the question is, well, how aged must the wine be in order for it to be poured on the altar? Seemingly, you would think that would have to be kind of older wine, right? So that it's better wine, right? The older the wine, the better it is. And here you're saying that once it's 40 days old, that is old enough, that is of enough vintage for it to be poured on the altar. And right, there is this twice daily sacrifice in the morning and the afternoon. When in the morning, I guess up to 4 hours, right? So from 4 hours and on, it could, at 4 hours in the morning, it is the time of when it is offered. I guess in the Torah itself, it isn't so explicit about when exactly that is. So there is a need also for some clarification in terms of just like when in the morning that is. Okay, so yeah, I think in this opinion here, it's from the 4th hour and on, we would say. From Yehuda ben Baba, we move to Rabbi Yeshua, Rabbi Nechoni ben Elinatan, Ish Kfar HaBavli. And one thing you'll see in the remainder of the tractate, there actually are a lot of these different mentionings of places, seemingly in the land of Israel. We're not really sure where all of them are. If it's Kfar HaBavli, that's kind of interesting. It's, I guess you would translate it literally as the village of the Babylonian one. If it's land of Israel, that might be surprising, but also I guess if it was Babylonia, then we don't need to signify that it is the Babylonian one because all the villages are Babylonian. But it does seem like actually already from a pretty early stage in the land of Israel, there were places that were associated with those who returned from Babylonia, right? And this, obviously, there was an early return to the land of Israel early in the Second Temple period, but also later on, there were continued kind of waves of people who came from Babylonia to the land of Israel. In the Talmud, it also talks about synagogues of the Babylonians, and they had their own rights relative to those who have been in the land of Israel for longer. So maybe it is something like that. But again, also, there's some of these place names and some of these people even that we only really know of from Mishnah Eduyot. So it's hard for us to really pin down who they were or where these places were. Okay, these people witnessed together. Ever min hamet shu tameh, lo amru ela al ever min hachai. Right. So the limb of a dead one is impure. A dead person. This is. The Rabbi Eliezer says this is only if it is the evel, the limb of someone who is still living. Right. That is what is impure and imparts impurity. It's kind of surprising, right? And the Chachamim respond to him and say, this is surprising. Amru la velo kal v'chomer. Uma min hachai shehu tahor, ever haporesh mimenu tameh, hamed shehu tameh eno din sheyeh ever haporesh mimenu tameh, right? According to your logic, someone who is living, we all could agree, is pure, generally speaking. So if you say that a limb that comes from them is impure, wouldn't you also say about someone who is dead, right? A corpse is, you agree, Rabbi Eliezer, impure. Wouldn't a limb from that corpse also be impure and impart impurity? And his response is fascinating. His response is, the Marlehem, lo amru ela al ever minachai, right? They did not say, whoever they is unclear, but seemingly it's some kind of early groups of rabbis. They only said that this thing about the limb being impure has to do with the limb of someone who is living. So even though it's surprising, he still passes on this testimony or this piece of this halakha, this early halakha, which he is familiar with. And I think this ties into something we know about Rabbi Eliezer ben Horkinus in general. He is someone who is a bit of an outlier in rabbinic tradition. He's very, very, very frequently mentioned in the Mishnah, but he's oftentimes kind of remembered as offering halachic opinions which are surprising. The Talmud actually refers to him as a shamuti, that is someone who was of the school of Beit Shammai. And the thinking is that he retains some halachic opinions of the school of Beit Shammai that the rabbis, as we saw last week, no longer agree with or have discarded, but he retains some of that and is still operating once Beit Shammai is no longer really in vogue, but he's still retaining some of that information. And also another thing that they talk about him, that they say is that they have him say in the Talmud that he never said anything that he did not hear from his rabbis, right? So he's remembered as this very important sage who is someone who really just is invested in transmitting earlier knowledge, earlier halachot, and not necessarily in creating new halachot or thinking of new rabbinic ideas, but just kind of transmitting things from the past, even if the logic is surprising or the halacha is surprising. So first you have just this statement, don't ask me, this is just what I remember, and I'm certain that this is what they said, right? That the limb of the living person contracts, imparts impurity, whereas the limb of a dead person does not. Davar acher, and now actually there will be a logical explanation. Meruba tumat hachayim metumat metim, right? Actually, there are ways in which the impurity of the living person is greater than the living of a corpse, than the impurity of a corpse. Right, that there are certain kinds of impure individuals who could impart impurity. They have some kind of discharge going on, and they have a certain impurity which does not exist with the dead body. Right, in order to then make an article of clothing or a person impure. And also the same kind of impurity can then contract to foods and drinks, which is not the case, but these are kinds of impurity that the corpse does not have, contract, nor impart. So it's kind of a roundabout way, because you would probably still think, even if that's the case, that there are these certain kinds of impurities that a living person can contract and impart that a corpse cannot, that you would still probably agree that the corpse is, I mean, really the biggest impurity there is. But he seems to be trying to explain this halacha, which he knows, which he heard from some kind of discarded rabbinic opinion. And the Mishnah is nevertheless kind of explaining to us what this opinion was, trying to find a reason for it. So just on this topic of Eliezer ben Hilkunus, a lot's been written about his unique attitude towards halacha. Jacob Neusner has a 2-volume work on him. And this is a very famous work on the right by Yitzchak Gilat, who's professor at Bar-Ilan University. Eliezer ben Hilkunus, a scholar outcast, right? Actually emphasizing just how different he was from the other rabbis, which again is surprising because despite the fact that he is remembered and is depicted as having these weird halachic opinions, they still are really invested, the rabbis of the Mishnah, in transmitting his opinions, right? They don't discard them entirely, and we could think about why they still are invested in bringing them. And this might go back to one of the early Mishnayot we saw in Eduyot, that actually there is an importance in bringing minority opinion, because that's what you know, it's only the opinion of one person, and therefore we should not rely on it. So maybe that's also why they still felt that it was so important to bring him. Maybe it was helpful for them to think with him. And also maybe this, despite the fact that they disagreed with him, they acknowledged that he was a really important halachic authority, and they shouldn't sideline him entirely. So this is not going to read it. It's one of the longest Mishnahs there is in the entire Mishnah. And it continues actually in a lot of the same topics that we saw just now in this somewhat complicated Mishnah, making it even more complicated. So not going to read it, but I will outline it a bit. Okay? There's a question about an olive's quantity, a kazayat, right? Familiar measurement from everyone at Seder a few nights ago. If an olive's quantity of flesh separated from a living limb, Rabbi Elazar says it's impure, as we saw in the prior Mishnah, and Rabbi Yoshua and Rabbi Nechunya say that it's pure. A smaller amount, a barley's grain quantity of bone, which comes from a living person, Rabbi Nechunya says it's impure, and Rabbi Yoshua and Rabbi Eliezer declare it pure. And you see there is something surprising here. You would think Rabbi Yoshua is consistent, but why you would think that Rabbi Eliezer and Nechunya would either say one or the other. They wouldn't necessarily differentiate between flesh and bone in these cases. So Rabbi Eliezer mounts a defense. A limb separated from a living person is impure, like a corpse is impure. And the sages rebut and say, according to this logic, a barley's grain quantity of bone separated from a living flesh should also be impure, right? If it would come from a corpse, it would be impure. So why is it also not the case if it comes from a living person? And the sages then ask Rabbi Nechunya, why is a barley's grain size of bone separated from a living limb impure, right? Why do you think that, Rabbi Nechunya? And he says that a limb separated from a living person is impure like an entire corpse. And they rebut and say that according to that logic, then also the flesh should be impure and not just the bone. And the sages have been asked Rabbi Eliezer, why should not both be pure or impure? And he basically has these somewhat convoluted answers that show that flesh is just kind of more susceptible to impurity than bone. They ask the same question to Rabbi Nechunya, and he also kind of finds a way of saying that bones are more impure than flesh. Very unique, very odd Mishnah. It seems like the halacha in the end is clearly not like Nechunya or Rabbi Eliezer. They actually, the sages clearly disagree with him, with both of them, and seem to side with Rabbi Yehoshua, saying that both of these cases, the flesh and the bone of the living person are pure. But it's surprising to see this kind of level of back and forth, this kind of shakla v'tarya, as we would say, if it was in the Talmud, this back and forth dialectic about these opinions. And this is really one of the most extensive debates we ever see in the Mishnah. And it's just surprising. Why would it be on this very random topic? And this gets back again to the uniqueness of this tractate, which has a lot of very weird traditions in it, including this Mishnah, which is, as I mentioned already a few times, really quite unique in terms of how the Mishnah looks in general. It's long, it's complicated, but I do think this outline should help you get through it if you go back to it or if you haven't gotten to it yet. So that whole chapter only has 3 mishnayot, because we have 2 regular size mishnayot, 6.1 and 6.2. And then we have 6.3, which is more than half the tractate, and again, one of the longest mishnahs in the entire. Okay, so let's move on to chapter 7. We have a slew now of different testimonies from different rabbis, starting first with Rabbi Tzadok. One of them is also brought with Rabbi Yehoshua. Rabbi Yehoshua, Rabbi Yehoshua, Rabbi Tzadok, al pidyon peter chamor shemet, she'en bo lakohen klum. So let's say you have a donkey, and you have a donkey's firstborn, which you need to bring to the priest. Not what it says here explicitly, but this is what's going on. Peter chamor shemet, pidyon peter chamor shemet. The donkey itself is not eligible for a priestly gift, and therefore you have to offer a sheep in its stead. If that sheep dies after you already said you were going to give it to the priest, must you bring another sheep? Remember, this sheep, the whole point of the sheep is that it's in the place of the firstborn donkey. And Rabbi Yehoshua and Rabbi Tzadok say that, no, you do not have to give the priest anything else. The second you said this was going to be for the priest, it was the priest's prerogative to come and get the sheep from you. And if you didn't get there in time, the sheep died, you're off the hook. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, chayavin ba'achrivtan kechamesh tzlaim shel ben. But Rabbi Eliezer says, just like the human, you have to actually replace it. You have to find a replacement sheep for that donkey. V'chachamim omrim en chayavin ba'achrivtan ela kefidyon shel ma'aser sheni. That actually it isn't like pidyon ben. It's just like ma'aser sheni, where there too, if something would happen to the ma'aser sheni and what was replacing the ma'aser sheni, then you would not be obligated to replace that. And then there's a whole area of halacha that has to do with eating bugs. I think nowadays Jews mainly don't eat bugs because it's hard for us to know which bugs are kosher or not. But back in the day, they were able to know which bugs really were kosher. So we're going to actually have a few halachot about that in the coming mishnayot. Right. So if you were, I guess, pickling to some extent or making some kind of brine for the bugs that you wanted to eat. So if you have the impure, as in the non-kosher bugs in that brine, the brine itself is still usable. And you could then drink it if you want, or pickle other bugs in it. Vidal juice, I guess, is what it would be. This is a fascinating case just historically for the development of the Mishnah. So that's his testimony that the tzil, the brine that was used for these unkosher bugs, is itself kosher or pure. And it says, "Shemishna rishona chagavim tmeim shenichbeshu im chagavim tohorim lo faslu tzira." That this earlier Mishnah that he's responding to and This is one of the rare instances in which the Mishnah kind of refers to the existence of a Mishnah that precedes the Mishnah that we have now. And it says that the halacha there was that if you have in one brine kosher and unkosher bugs, in that case, the brine is okay. But Rabbi Tzadok says that actually not just if you have a mix of kosher and unkosher bugs, but even if it's just non-kosher bugs, this is the newer Mishnah, that brine is also kosher. Rabbi Tzadok al zochalin sherabu al nutfim shehem ksherim. So this is confusing because zochalin does not refer to bugs that are creepy crawlers, and the verb would be zochalin for crawling, but rather it refers to the water of a mikvah. So if you have a body of water and you're making a mikvah out of rainwater or something like that, which is collected, you have to get to 40 se'ah, a certain amount of water, in order for it to be kosher mikvah. But if it's just running water, like a stream or something, there is no exact fixed amount, and as long as there's running water, it's kosher even if you have less than 40 se'ah of that water. So if you have running water, zochalin, in one pool that is more than the dripping water would be to 40 se'ah, it's enough. You don't have to actually have the amount of 40 se'ah because you have a running current of water there. And this actually happened, right? This actually happened in the capital of Puriya, not exactly sure where that is, someplace in Israel. And they brought this case before the sages, and the sages said that the mikvah was kosher. Rabbi Tzadok al zochalin shekilchan ba'alei agod shehem ksherim. Rabbi Tzadok said, if you have this kind of running water, and you basically had to direct the water in a certain way by using leaves, so it's kind of leaves of agod. What kind of is that? I forgot the English word right now. For like basically the leaves of this tree, that kind of mikvah is also kosher. This also happened in a certain place. And they brought it not just before the sages, but they brought it before the court of the sages in the temple, and they said that it was okay. Okay, let's continue. Moving away from Rabbi Tzadok, but sticking with Rabbi Yeshua. Rabbi Yeshua testifies also with Rabbi Yakim Ish Hagar. So also. Al Kalal Shel Chatat Shinetano Al Gabe Hasheretz and they testified about a jar, this would be a stone jar, which cannot contract tumah, right? A stone vessel cannot become impure, but it is filled with the ashes of the red heifer, right? This is like highly potent ritual substance, which has to be guarded at all costs. And if you accidentally place a stone jar filled with ashes of the red heifer on a bug, a creeping thing of some sort, that would be bad. You don't want to accidentally get this very difficult to produce purifying substance impure. And according to them, that if you did that, even though the jar remains impure because it's a stone vessel, and the jar remains impure, the ashes themselves, according to Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Yakim Mishadal, their testimony, the ashes become. But on top of that, they also testify that Rabbi Eliezer says that it is pure. These do not become impure because they're in a stone vessel, and the stone vessel cannot contract impurity and therefore pass off the impurity from the creeping thing to the ashes themselves. Interesting case in which almost like Rabbi Eliezer's traditionalism or conservatism ends up leaning to leniency, right? It isn't just that he's always the more stringent one. Actually, sometimes a more strict reading or more conservative reading of the verses and of the purity laws actually allow for leniency. Like in this specific case, that you happen to have a stone jar full of red heifer ashes and you place it on a creeping thing. The Eid, Rabbi Papias, Mishnah Zal, שתי נזירות, שאם גילח את הראשונה יום 30, שמגלח השנייה יום 60, ואם גילח יום 60 חסר אחד, יצא שיום 30 עולה לו מן. Then we recall last time we already saw that there was this, the way it works with if one was to say that they're going to be a Nazarite, that usually that is for a term of 30 days. After the 30 days, you should shave your head. But let's say you did it for 2 minutes back to back. Someone would say something, please don't take my word here, that I will now be a Nazarite for 2 units of time. That would be interpreted as 60 days. So do you cut your hair once at the end of the 60 days, or do you cut it at the 30 mark and the 60 mark? And basically what he's saying here is that you could actually kind of count the beginning day, the last day of one unit as the beginning day of the following unit. So you could even get to a kind of counting as if it's 59 days, okay? If you were to cut your hair on day 30, that would then restart the count, and that day 30 would also count as the first day for the second cycle, and you would only end up being a Nazir for 59 days. So if you accidentally made the vow to be a Nazir for 2 units of time, i.e. for 2 units of 30 days, you could get this kind of hack to get it down to 59 days, as long as you cut on the 30th day. So let's say you have an animal designated to offer as a shlamim sacrifice, a peaceful sacrifice, which you could offer this kind of because you want to, or this is a kind of sacrifice which is offered on holidays. Now the animal is waiting, Pesach's coming. And before you offer the sacrifice, the animal has a baby. What happens to that child? And they say here that you could offer that animal as a sacrifice too. You can't do anything else with it. You could offer it as a sacrifice. We have Rabbi Eliezer here again, and you've noticed probably there's a lot of these instances when the Mishnah here is very invested in bringing Rabbi Eliezer's dissenting opinion. He says that no, you cannot do anything with that animal. And the thing is that you then go and just basically the animal just lives until it dies. You cannot really do anything with it. And Chachamim Omrim Yikrav, but the sages side with Rabbi Yeshua and Papias and say that yes, you actually can offer the offspring of an animal designated for a sacrifice as a sacrifice. So the thinking is, why not? So what's the problem here? What's Rabbi Eliezer's logic? And there is probably some logic to this. And that's that, let's say you designate an animal, and then you kind of regret it. And you push it off, and you say, you know what, I'm just going to wait for the animal to have a kid, another kid, and then eventually you just don't offer the sacrifice. And the animal you designated to offer as a sacrifice is no longer a valid animal. Okay, so the sages say this is actually okay, because this is specifically something which actually is good. Like we actually do want animals specifically if they can be offered as sacrifices. And here too we have a case. Rabbi Papias, we see where his testimony comes from. So we've already seen a few cases in which, or a few instances in which there is a halacha, and then the rabbis say actually this very thing happened. But in this Mishnah, we kind of get a sense how Rabbi Papias formed his testimony. Right? It says Yid Rabbi Yeshua Rabbi Papias, and here the Mishnah ends by saying Amar Rabbi Papias, Ani me'id, I testify. We had a cow that was designated to be offered as a shlamim sacrifice, nuha Pesach, and we ate it on Passover. We offered it on Pesach. And we ate its child, shlamim bechan. And on Sukkot, we went and had his child as a sacrifice. So we could see that his testimony really comes from the fact that he practiced this in Jerusalem, right? He's a rabbi following the destruction, but this goes back to the practice that he himself did in Jerusalem. And the fact that he did it in Jerusalem and it was allowed is the source of this halachic tradition. So really, it seems like a totally random area of halacha, which it is, but it allows us to kind of get a sense of this very moment of, right, being the moment actually also on Pesach, but more the historical moment that the Mishnah is describing of kind of coming from Jerusalem to Yavna and retaining this tradition around what went on in the Jerusalem temple as these early rabbis themselves experienced in Jerusalem. And so the question for scholars of the Mishnah is, to what extent can we then extrapolate to the Mishnah in general? The Mishnah talks about the temple a ton. And given that we have some rabbis who do actually say these are things that I experienced in the Jerusalem temple, we then say that basically a lot of these tractates, these vachim, nachot, various tractates that talk about the temple also really go back to these rabbis' own experiences or own kind of knowledge, firsthand knowledge of what happened in the Jerusalem temple. Okay, the same group, right? Rabbi Yezel, sorry, Rabbi Yeshua, and Rabbi Papias. Right on, this is kind of like the boards that are used by bakers, and the thinking is, again, remember we had this question of basically in order to contract purity, something must be a vessel. So when they say that they are impure, that means that they are vessel-like enough to contract impurity. But here too, Rabbi Eliezer's conservatism leads him to be more lenient, and he says that actually no, these are not truly vessels; they're just boards, and therefore they're pure at all times, and they cannot become. They also testified about a certain kind of oven that's made by different blocks. There's sand that's in between each block, so that it's actually very possible, seemingly very easily, to kind of take it apart, the whole oven. And they said that this is, although it's seemingly somewhat haphazardly built, it is vessel-like enough to contract impurity. Which Rabbi Eliezer, again, his conservatism leads him to say, this is not a vessel, and therefore it is always pure, right? It cannot become impure. They also testified, right? So if there is an extra month, if it's a leap year, the extra month is Adar Bet, right? We treat Adar, the first Adar, as if it is the leap year. We don't have Purim in it. And then we treat Adar Bet as if it is the main Adar last month. But that is the year that is intercalated. And the question is, how late in the year can we intercalate the year? So we certainly can't do it after Adar, because the leap month has to be Adar Bet. So what happens is, let's say you have the month of Adar going on. How late in the month can the intercalation occur? Right? They used to say had to do it by prayer, but there's some logic to that. Nowadays we always know, but the thinking is that, let's say you do the holiday of Purim, and then they intercalate the year. So you have to do the holiday again. So thinking would be is that, yeah, well, we should probably make sure that we decide whether we're going to intercalate or not before the holiday comes around. Actually, the Mishnah Megillah entertains this and says that it treats it as an eye. For the Mishnah Megillah, it's obvious that it could happen that the year would be intercalated after one or even Megillah on 14. So what they say here is that it used to be the case that they would say, or people would say only until Purim, but they said actually no. If need be, we could even intercalate the year after Purim was already celebrated. And on the same topic of adding a leap year, they said that you could also intercalate the year al Tanai. What does it mean to intercalate the year al Tanai? So basically, this becomes an extremely important topic. Actually, it's an important topic for the entirety of the first millennium, really, in Jewish history. Who has the right to decide the year is going to be intercalated? And the rabbis in the land of Israel really always say it's our right. And not just initially our right, but it's the right of the head court, of the main court. And in earlier periods, it's the right specifically of the family of Rabban Gamliel. Right? This is the family of the Nesi'im, the patriarchs, who kind of rule the Jewish community in the eyes of the rabbis, who are they are the most important rabbis. Very interesting family, which I'm sure Rabbi Kelsen will talk about also when you try to get a vote in a few months. Important in that we know that Rabbi Nasi, the author of the Mishnah, was of that family. We know ancestors of theirs from the time of the Second Temple. Right? They're mentioned in the Testament. They're mentioned also by Josephus as being really very important rabbis. Sorry, not rabbis, don't use that word, but very important leaders. Pharisees also, Pharisaic leaders at the end of the Second period. And seemingly they are the ones who the rabbis assume were in charge of the question of interpretation. So the following story will help us understand what it means to intercalate al Tanai, that is conditionally intercalated.
I'm sorry. Can I ask you something? I can't understand the verb you're using.
Intercalate.
Matriculate?
Intercalate. It means to.
Intercalate. I know what it is. I just have to understand.
Oh,
Okay,
sure, yeah.
thank you.
So, yeah, so in Hebrew, it's me'ablim, right? To basically it means to make bigger. Umasev Rabban Gamliel shehalach lito reshut ve'hagamon b'Surya v'shehalavo. There were some instances in which Rabban Gamliel went to the Roman ruler in Syria to ask permission for something. We don't know for what, and it took him time to come back home. And the rabbis back home realized they got to start figuring out the intercalation. They have to see if it's going to be a leap year or not. What they decided to do was they would say, we're going to make it a leap year, just on the condition that when Rabban Gamliel comes home, he will decide whether it really is a leap year or not. When he got back from Syria, he said, you know what? I do want this. This is a good call. You were correct. This should be a leap year. And then the year was. So here too, we have an instance in which we really see how the testimony is formulated from an event that occurred, right? They witnessed this happen with Rabban Gamliel, and then it becomes testimony in the Idu. But here, instead of the event having taken place in Jerusalem, it took place in Yavne. This is actually from a few decades after the destruction of the temple. But you could see where a lot of these testimonies probably come from, which is from halachic practice as observed. And then it becomes kind of a dictum, becomes like halachic saying, halachic line, as opposed to it being repetition of the story itself. Okay. Now, okay. He'id Menachem ben Signai, not a very well-known person at all. Al Musaf Hayura shel Shokei Zetim Shu Tameh, shel Tzabaim Shehu Tohom. Okay. If one is preparing olives, or if one is preparing leather, big vats. And alongside those vats, there are some kind of lid or lintel, maybe like some kind of area that's surrounding the vat. And again, we have this question of, yes, the vat itself is certainly a vessel, therefore we can track purity, but is this kind of lintel around it also a vessel, therefore liable to become? It's hard for us, I think, every commentary I've seen was a very difficult time fully understanding mechanics of this. Seemingly, the vats used by the olive makers, the vats used by the leather makers, the tanners, are a bit different how they look. And for the olive makers, the lintel is seemingly very important. Therefore, it can become impure because it is a vessel. Whereas those of the tanners is not really a vessel and therefore cannot contract purity. But Shahu Omrim Chilufatrim. Nachem ben Signai gave this testimony, and therefore everyone retracted their prior opinion, which was that no, the lintels of the olive maker's vats are not a vessel, not becoming pure. The lintels of the tanner's vats are a vessel and can. That's what happened. Ira ben Nechunya ben Gudgoda ben Gudgoda. Al Chareshet Shesia Aviha Shehilza Vigint. So Rabbi Nechunya says that a deaf woman, who her father had married her to somebody else, that she actually is divorced. And the thinking is that, in halacha, the deaf person doesn't have much of a halachic status. They oftentimes are understood to not really have knowledge because they cannot do all kinds of things. And here actually they're giving the deaf woman more agency than the others would have thought in the halachic parameters, because it's saying that they actually need to be divorced if they want to be married, if their marriage was over. And it's not that, meaning that actually they can be married at all. And so this could seem like it is, in one sense, bad for the woman, right? But on the other hand, actually, the thinking is, I think here, that the rabbis requiring a husband to give a deaf person a get as what allows the woman to be married in the first place. Because if there was no way out of the marriage, because the get requires knowledge of the wife, men would not want to marry deaf women at all. So they basically now that there is recourse for the marriage to dissolve, or ability for marriage to dissolve, men would be willing to marry women in this death. So that's, I think, the idea of this testimony. Once a woman who is an Israelite marries a priest, she is then able to eat from priestly tithes. A minor who marries in general, that marriage is only valid according to rabbinic law, but not according to Torah law. So given that it is only rabbinic law, it's not obvious that a minor marrying a priest would then be able to eat from the tithes. But here the testimony is that even though it's only rabbinically valid and not from the Torah itself, she is already able to eat tithes. And that if she dies, even though it's just a rabbinically mandated marriage, her husband is also able to inherit whatever she might have brought into marriage. If one has a plank of some sort that was stolen and then was built into a structure, so ideally one would have to return the plank itself and therefore destroy the structure that he built with it. The problem is, if somebody was required to do that, no one would admit that they stole the board. But then they want to have to destroy the building. But in this case, basically they're saying that person is allowed to just give over the monetary amount that plank is worth. And therefore people will be more inclined to own up to the fact that they stole planks and used it to build their buildings. So chatat sacrifice, an atonement sacrifice. Ideally, no sacrifice should be from a stolen animal. But the question is whether the ritual performed in that an ideal fashion, that is by using a stolen animal, whether the ritual is efficacious, whether the ritual of atonement worked or not. And basically the priests, you understand, they would be extremely nervous about every animal coming into the temple, or perhaps it is stolen. And so thinking here is that if they were so nervous, then they wouldn't really offer sacrifices. So the rabbi is limited to saying that, generally speaking, stolen animals, unless it is absolutely known the specific animal is stolen, the animal is still able to enact atonement in the temple itself. Right? The altar cannot, for the welfare of the altar, I guess, because it's important for the altar to continue. So it's interesting because it kind of gets to kind of the metaphysical nature of stolenness. Right? The animal could be stolen, but nobody knows. And since nobody knows, stolenness of the animal does not detract from its ability to actually be an efficacious animal. It's only the fact that that we all know that it was stolen that makes the animal unable to actually perform the ritual. So various lists of testimonies. How much time do we have? Okay,
Can I ask you a question?
Please, Betty.
It seems to me that stealing an animal to bring it for a korban, the problem would be stealing the animal. They're more worried about that the Kohanim would be worried about it rather than the fact that the actual idea of stealing an animal for a korban is not a problem.
I think they also are worried about that, but there's no disagreement about. Obviously, you shouldn't steal animals. The question is, we're living in a world when, the priests, you have to imagine, there's dozens of animals coming through the temple every day. And if they thought that it would be unable to actually sacrifice, if they were too worried about just the stolenness of any of the given animals, they might, it would just make the whole process too difficult for it. And so they say, we don't have to really worry about it unless we know, generally speaking, that this is an excellent animal. If someone comes and says, it's kind of the law is valid until someone comes and says, oh, wait, no, that's the animal that someone stole from me. You don't have to prove the animal wasn't stolen. It's on the person who it was stolen from to then come and say, hey, that animal was stolen from me. You see what I'm saying? Sorry, you're muted, Debbie.
Well, it has to do with, they're worried about the legitimacy of the whole system.
Mhm.
that
Yeah.
the point?
Yeah. I think they're worried that it wouldn't really be possible to have like a functioning temple if the priest had to constantly be worried about whether the animals were stolen or not. So it's really only if it's like a well-known fact that this animal was stolen that it doesn't actually work, the ritual itself. Okay.
Was it a big problem?
I don't know if we know it's a problem. I think the assumption here is that, at least in the eyes of the priest, it was a problem, and they didn't want to have to worry about it too much. So the best way to worry about it is to, yes, of course, we should dissuade people from actually bringing stolen animals, but we should also say, if the animal happens to be stolen, the sacrifice was still valid. Okay.
To render the whole issue moot.
Yeah, not the whole issue, because it doesn't say it doesn't say this is stolen sacrifice. It says so specifically stolen animals that aren't well known to be stolen animals. But if it's a well-known stolen animal, obviously no one's going to allow it in. Cool. Okay. So moving on to the final chapter. I guess this is material really that we haven't really fully got into yet in Mishnah Yomit, but we'll go through it as this is our final class talking about Mishnah Yomit. Okay. Fascinating case here, because this also came up earlier, but for some reason, there's some things actually which start appearing again in the tractate, even though they were mentioned earlier. This came up earlier actually this actually came up in the prior chapter as an opinion of Beit Shammai. It seems like it was also the opinion of the Shur ben Betera, that the blood of a nevela is pure, even though the flesh itself isn't pure. Rabbi Shimon ben Betera, efer chatat shenaga tamei b'miktzatto shetimei et kulo. Right, so we have a heap of ashes. If someone who is impure touches some of it, what happens to the rest of those ashes? Is it like one specific item, or is each individual ash, possibly hundreds of ashes in there, its own specific thing, and therefore, if some ashes are impure, that doesn't pass on to the other ashes in the pile. And according to this testimony, that the mound of ashes itself is like one object, and therefore, if some of it was touched by an impure person, the entire thing becomes impure. הוסיף רבי עקיבא, על הסולת ועל הקטורת ועל התמונה והגחלים שנגע תפוליום ומקצתם, שפסל את כולם. Rabbi Akiva adds, not just with the ashes of the red heifer, but actually other kinds of things that are in the temple in heaps, right? So it could be incense heaps or other things of that nature. Also, basically, if some of it is touched by a person who is not fully pure yet, right? They get to the mikvah but haven't waited until nightfall to become fully pure, that everything there becomes impure. So it has to do just kind of with like, I guess, the physical makeup of certain things in the temple. Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Baba, Rabbi Yehuda Kohen. הקטנה בת ישראל שנאספת כהן, שהיא אוכלת בתרומה, כיוון שנכנסה לחופה, אף על פי שלא נבלה. So we saw already earlier this case of, well, when does basically, in which cases could a Bat Yisrael, who is a minor, actually eat from the priestly ties? And we said that it's rabbinically mandated marriage, so therefore it needs to be said that she's allowed to eat ties. And here it says that even from the moment of chuppah, from the beginning of the marriage, even though they're not fully married like that. Here Rabbi Yossi HaKohen, Rabbi Zechariah ben Tzav, al tinoket shepur hana v'ashkelon. So they had a testimony concerning a young child, a female child, who had been taken as collateral in Ashkelon, similarly by an family. Jewish one who had been taken by a non-Jewish family as collateral. And when she was returned to the family actually kind of distanced her. They did not treat her as fully one of them. Seemingly, this means that they no longer thought that she was allowed to marry priests, right? They thought that she had been raped, and given that had happened, then she would no longer be eligible to marry a priest. But the witnesses testified that she was not put at any point kind of in a room alone with a Jewish male, and that she should not defile. She would not. So the Chachamim come here and they tell the family, Amru lahem Chachamim, if you believe she was taken captive as collateral, then you should also believe the witnesses who testified that she was not secluded, nor that she was purified, that she was defiled. And if you do not believe that she was not secluded, also not defiled, then do not also believe that she was taken as collateral. So, difficult case, but interesting to see that the sages actually really come out here against the family themselves and try and kind of convince them not to distance her. Okay, this is interesting because usually the Mishnah is in Hebrew, but for some reason, and I have not yet found a good reason as to why, this Mishnah is in Arabic. Right, so mentioned earlier that there is this difficulty in knowing which bugs are kosher or not, which is why I think the rest probably go bugs. Not that we might be rushing the bugs if we didn't know which ones were kosher or not. And he says that ayal kamsa, which is some kind of bug. I guess it's a bug that looks like a I don't know, maybe a deer-shaped bug. I don't know what that is, but it is pure. So bi'al mashkevet achaya bi'inun dach, and also that the liquid basically that's running the floor of the slaughterhouse of the temple, that it is also pure, right? You can imagine that this is important because there's probably a lot of fluids running around there on the liquids on the floor of the temple, water, oils, wine, and blood. And if you would say that that is impure, that would create quite a bit of a problem for folks who are trying to hold on to their purity so they could sacrifice more animals all the time. He says that it testifies that actually those fluids, those liquids are pure. And those that touch a dead person become impure, which is weird that needs to be said at all. Again, I have yet to find a very convincing explanation of it because it's such a well-known thing. Whoever touches a dead animal a dead person becomes impure. But that is what it says here. It could have to do with the number of days that one becomes impure for, but it's not so clear. And also, again, the whole idea of this Mishnah being Aramaic is also just a very unclear Mishnah, even within this Tractate of Eduyot. The Karolei Yosef Shalia, because of his opinions, the first two opinions here, he was referred to as Yossi the permitter, right? Shali permitted. Rabbi Akiva Mishum Nechemia Ish Beit Shemasi'in Ha'isha Al Beit Ed Achad. So we actually already saw this today, right? This concept that one can allow basically only one witness is necessary to relay that a woman's husband died, therefore freeing her from being. So if we already saw this, why does Rabbi Akiva see the need to mention it again? Why does the Mishnah feel the need to bring Rabbi Akiva's opinion again? It could be that there's just different sources here that are being mixed together, although the Mishnah elsewhere, Eduyot, seems to explain that this is actually important because, right, if we have the opinion of one person and it's just an individual's opinion, that is an individual rabbi's opinion, we might not think that it actually is the halacha. Now that Rabbi Akiva also says that we get additional people, this shows that actually no, there's enough people out there who actually hold this, enough rabbis out there who hold this opinion, but that we can be certain that this is the actual halacha. Okay. We eat. Yeah. Okay. I'm gonna have to skip a bit. I want to see the last Mishnah. Okay. You'll see these. I actually don't think they're such difficult ones, but the Mishnah ends up becoming towards the end very interested in the question of priestly. Okay. And the question of whether priestly families married correctly in such a fashion such that their offspring continue to be legitimate priests. And that's the topic on which the Mishnah ended the chapter. So we only skipped a little bit. That was the last Mishnah. רבי יהושע, הוא בא לנו מרבי יוחנן בן זכאי, ששמע מרבו ורבו מרבו הלכה למשה מסיני, שאין אליהו בא לטמא ולטהר ולרחק ולקרב, אלא לרחק המקורבים בזרוע ולקרב המרחוקים בזרוע. So he has a testimony, Yeshua, from Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, right? This very famous rabbi who really was a pivotal rabbi moving the rabbinic movement from Jerusalem to Yavna, really establishing it there. He heard from his teacher, from his teacher, from his teacher, all the way going back to Moses and Sinai. Eliyahu Navi, right? When he will come, he will not purify or he will not defile nor purify families, or distance or bring close families. This is priestly families that are referring to their lineage, whether it is clean or not. Rather, he will distance those who were brought close by force, and bring close those who were distanced by force. Right. So the thinking is that there was some politics at play here as well. Right. There are priests who have certain lineages because of what happened in their families and the marriages which occurred between, whether they were legitimate Christian marriages or not. But there is also an element of some kind of body of priests who might be forcing some families out and forcing some families in. When Eliyahu Navi comes, he won't actually go back to, he won't decide actually historically whether these families are pure or not. He'll just actually take note of how force was used in bringing them closer or pushing them away. So again, it's not what ontologically is true, but it's rather sociologically what happened and how these folks were treated. That's what he will take into consideration.
Can you explain the le'ashvot ha'machloket?
Yeah, sure.
The le'ashvot, I know what le'ashvot is, but the process, like what it means.
So this goes on. So in this first tradition here about Eliyahu Navi, is specifically with priestly families, and this goes on also with Rabbi Yehuda's opinion, right here, which says the karev avo lo l'rachek. He will only actually try and bring families closer to the priesthood, but he won't actually try and distance families. And Rabbi Shimon says something else. Lahashvot hamachloket, right? Actually, what Eliyahu Navi will do is actually try to dissolve difference in general. Seemingly, this isn't just about the priestly families, but about rabbinic machlokot and disagreements in general, which is like a very interesting place also to see near the end of Eduyot. In general, this whole thing is because it is, first of all, a reflection here on the fact that there is a lot of, first of all, we're back into the priestly territory, and this whole question of the place of the rabbis relative to the priests. And this is a tractate which is very invested in trying to think about how the rabbis kind of became a movement following the destruction of the Jerusalem temple. And it's also commenting a bit on the problematic nature of priestly leadership and how they use force in that. And it brings up a lot of disagreements between rabbis in general about all kinds of issues. And Rabbi Shimon says that part of what Eliyahu will do is actually to smooth out, to lahashvot, to make equal, to smooth out the differences, to make differences something that will be a thing of the past. So this, if in the Messianic era, there no longer will be disagreements. And this whole tractate is something which is really b'diavad. The temple was destroyed. We must now know what the disagreements are. But one day, Eliyahu Navi will come and solve all the differences. And this is kind of the root of that tradition, which begins in the Middle Ages, at the word teku in the Bavli, right? When something is unclear at the end of the sugya, right? That Tishbi Yitaretz Kushiot V'Havayot, right? That Tishbi Eliyahu Navi, Eliyahu Tishbi, he will come and solve all of these difficulties that we have. We can't figure out what the halakha is. So most of the Mishnah is about priestly lineage, but I think that specific line of Lashvot or Machloket is about disagreement in general. But the last line of Chachamim comes back to the priestly lineage. Chachamim omrim lo lerachek v'lo lekarev, not to distance, nor to bring close, ela la'asot shalom ba'olam. But actually, he will try and make peace in the world in general. Shenamar hinei anochi sholach lachem et Eliyahu Navi v'gomer v'shiv levavot habanim v'lev banim alav otam. So actually, something we just read a few days ago in synagogue.
That was just the Haftorah.
Yeah, it's just the Haftorah. That the idea is that he will come and not just worry about the priests, not just worry about the specific disagreements between the rabbis, but actually about peace in the world. And I think this tractate is fascinating because it engages in history in a very interesting way, right? It begins, it talks halakha. The rabbis, that's what they do. They do halakha. But they do think about historical questions, and they are thinking in the background here about this moment of trying to bring knowledge from the period of the temple into the rabbinic moment, and trying to organize that knowledge, remember things, to make it something which folks can remember. But at the same time, they're also thinking about the future, and they're thinking about what possibly could look better, right? How could the world be better? And it's not actually specifically in this vision necessarily going back to the way things were. It isn't. They don't choose to emphasize that, at least not. They don't choose to emphasize that in the context of what Eliyahu's role is, but rather that there should be peace, and the priestly families will find a way to fix themselves, and the rabbis will find a way to fix themselves and to get across their disagreements. But most importantly, it really is peace in the world in general. And it's if it goes in this one Mishnah from the priests to the rabbis in general to the world at large. So it's actually a very poetic ending, even if it's really in this context of what seems to be a very obtuse tractate, which is extremely unique relative to the Mishnah in general. I had some time for that. I'm going to stop sharing. It's also out of time. But I do want to say, I really enjoy going back to this tractate. It's been a while since I looked at it. I do think, after going through it with you all, that this is a very early part of the Mishnah. I mentioned in the past that there's this disagreement among scholars whether Eduyot was collected from other parts of the Mishnah and then brought together here. But going through it like this, I really do think that this is a very early stage of the rabbinic production of the Mishnah, and that this is an early way of organizing halakha. And you can really see how they're thinking about how halakha should be organized following the destruction of the temple, how halakha should be remembered, created. And I do think that this is really early evidence we have for the rabbinic project, and that the parts that we see here that also exist in other tractates are really copied from here. So they're respective tractates where the content comes up again. So thank you for the opportunity to come back to it. I hope that you will continue the next few days to finish it up if you haven't already. And no time is out, but if anyone has any questions, quickly good answer.
And just before we get to the questions, I do want to let people know that while this class is wrapping up, Mishnah in Depth will continue with starting with Avodah Zarah next week. This will also be on Tuesday evenings, 8 p.m. Eastern, this time with Rabbanit Leah Sarna. And back to the questions for people who have questions.
And we'll get a sign up for that?
If you have signed up, yes. If you have signed up for Mishnah in Depth of Avodah Zarah, you can expect to receive an email. If you already signed up, you actually should already have an email with the called confirmation email with a link to join, and you should expect that soon before the class as well. Modeh Simcha, and thank you, Dr. Landes, for these past few weeks of teaching at Drisha.
Thank you. Rifka.